And yet, here's something that I think we need to think about. Whenever we consider these possibilities, we need to constantly be mindful of the fact that we love to scare the hell out of ourselves.
Warning, this is not entertainment.
Tales of advanced beings bringing knowledge and wisdom to humankind are as old as civilization itself. You could go all the way back to our earliest known written records in cuneiform, and you can find examples of humans coming face to face with beings that were foreign to them, beings that do not seem to be of this world, but yet nonetheless came bearing gifts of great knowledge and great wisdom that would propel humanity forward in terms of technological advancement and progress. If you turn on the History Channel at any point in the last decade, you see shows like Ancient Aliens, which have really grabbed this narrative and harnessed it to kind of push forward an idea that visitors from outer space were the protogenesis, the first movers that really created this spark of divinity in man that led to the modern world. Kind of like the story of Prometheus and his flame of fire, but at a much more grandiose level. You see this narrative in Hollywood with movies like Prometheus, for example, where you see aliens kind of either sacrificing themselves or coming to the human race and giving a portion of themselves or a portion of the knowledge that they've gained over the eons and passing it along to humans, knowing that it would take thousands, if not millions of years for these things to play out into their full fruition into the future. But nonetheless, the story is clear that all of the mass knowledge and wisdom that humanity has accrued did not come from terrestrial sources, but from somewhere else, somewhere out there. And this is the narrative I want to jump into today. I think it's an important conversation to have because there's so many ideas swirling that subtly and sometimes not so subtly indoctrinate us. They teach us to kind of make assumptions about where we came from and also where we are going as a people. And some of those ideas are rooted in this idea of greater knowledge that came from outside of this world. Whether you take a traditional view that all knowledge comes from one supreme being, that being God, a God who is the creator of the universe, or that it comes from aliens or creators or maybe multiple deities from somewhere else, or maybe in some esoteric way they just come from the ether, from some sort of abstract consciousness that is not of us, some sort of muse. These things all suppose that knowledge started elsewhere and was passed on to man. And that's an important thing. It shouldn't be overlooked or understated. But is it true? Is there reason to believe that all the knowledge, all the wisdom that man has accrued over time started, that first domino that fell began with something that was less than human, or maybe more than human? There's a word that you can trace back to the Akkadians and the Sumerians, a word they used for a species that was not like us, but was wiser than us. They called them the Apkallu. Now, I won't dissect what the Apkallu were or go into the semantics of what the creatures represent and their origin story, etc. This won't be a 101 type episode. I'm just going to assume a foundational knowledge of understanding of the Apkallu and a couple of other terms and creatures referenced in literature that I suspect most of my audience is going to be familiar with. And if you're not, you can go back and listen to past podcasts that we've done with guests like Dr. Michael Heiser or Jim Vieira, which touches on some of these ancient myths and some of these stories and some of these creatures and entities. So the Apkallu, going all the way back to the Akkadians. The Sumerian actually had a different name. I think they called them the Abgal, but it's essentially the same thing, and Apkallu is the more familiar term. They're sometimes used interchangeably with the Anunnaki, which I'm sure 90% of you listening are familiar with the Anunnaki, those who from the heavens came. The idea around the Anunnaki, again, this is one that ancient aliens and shows like that have picked up on. The idea is that these creatures came from outer space. Those from the heavens came to Earth, brought great wisdom. And there seems to be evidence to suggest that there may be literature and ancient history that supports this idea. Now, what's interesting about the Apkallu is that this term, again, sometimes used interchangeably with Anunnaki, just means, in general, at the highest, most simple form, wisdom, the wise, or the sage. Now, however, specific to the Sumerian and Akkadian cultures in which the Apkallu are referenced, they refer to a group of demigods. Now, specifically, this is a group of 7 demigods. And they're also sometimes referred to as the Paradu, or part fish. And this is because they were said to have features that looked kind of fish-like, or maybe reptile-like, scaly skin, and different attributes that were clearly not human in nature. Now, we'll talk a little bit later in this episode whether that was just an idea of misidentification or just using comparisons based on the world they knew, which is not uncommon. If a creature from another realm or another planet came to this world and they didn't look like you would equate them to something else on your own planet or terrestrial plane to compare them to. So it's not unusual to say that they looked like part men and part fish necessarily in and of itself. But what's interesting about these Apkallu, or these 7 demigods, is what they represent in terms of the origin story that they encompass. So without going too far into the weeds, you can certainly read this just by looking through any of the cuneiform scripts that the Sumerians and the Akkadians left behind. There's references to the Apkallu all over the place, especially in their genealogies of their kings. I want to talk about one story in particular, and this is the Myth of Awanis. Oannes was one of those Apkallu creatures that we referenced. It is said that he was the emissary of the god Ea. And what's interesting about Oannes is that he was considered to be the first sage. So he would be the Prometheus type, or maybe the Semjaza, or the Azazel, if you want to use the biblical Enochian story of the Watchers as a comparison. He kind of fills that role as the prime mover, the one who really came and knocked over that first domino for humanity in terms of the wisdom that he provided. He's referred to as the first sage, and it's said that he came out of the sea. It's said that Oannes came bearing the tablets of destiny, and that these were important texts filled with wisdom of the gods, written on clay tablets in cuneiform script and shared with the people of Sumeria. It's said that he was the first to introduce them to the story of the creation of mankind. What's interesting about this is that Enuma Elish, considered to be the oldest creation story known to mankind, tells the story of Marduk and his rise to supremacy, where he defeats the serpent goddess Tiamat. Well, Tiamat, as you know, is referenced in the Judeo-Christian Bible in the book of Genesis as the deep. You encounter her in Genesis 1, and if you know the Hebrew, Tehom or Tehom is very similar in etymology to the word Tiamat. So many scholars have concluded, and I think rightly so, that Tehom, or the deep, referenced in Genesis 1, where it says God, or Elohim, hovered over the face of the deep, basically submitting the deep, or chaos. This would be Tiamat, basically created order and harnessed creation for himself. Almost verbatim what happens in the story of Marduk and Enuma Elish, and how he slays the dragon and basically kills disorder and chaos and creates order. It's said that this story first appeared from the sea, when an Apkallu, a wise sage, came out of the sea, part man, part fish, by the name of Oannes, an emissary of the god Ea. And he told mankind about the gods. He told them about the creation, the origin of the universe, the origin of the cosmos, and the origin of their own species. And from there, with all the wisdom that he provided, the Sumerians and the Akkadians went on to build the first great empire in human history. Is it a coincidence that this story pops up multiple times in different cultures around the world? You be the judge of that, but it is interesting at the very least. It's said that Oannes was not the last of the Apkallu, but he was only the first. There were several others who came after, again coming out of the sea, part man, part fish, and that they would share wisdom, secrets, whether it be about medicine or about warfare or about astronomy. There were so many gifts imparted to mankind that the technological advancement seemed to be rampant and at a speed that humans had not known for thousands of years before. It was a spark, a big bang moment of knowledge. A historian by the name of Berosus, writing about ancient Babylon, describing Babylonia in its ancient days, granted he did write in approximately 280 BC, so this was centuries after the fall of the Sumerians and the Akkadians, millennia after the fall even. But nonetheless, he's our our most ancient and our most reliable source on ancient Babylonian culture, he talks about this Oannes in great detail. He's the first one who writes about him. He uses a variant of the word Oannes. I think he refers to him as Uanna, Uanna, rather than Oannes. But he's said to have basically taught the people, the origin of the creation myth among all these other things. Berosus pens that first. Now, you could say that's similar to a Josephus writing about ancient Judaism thousands of years after the fact, or maybe somebody like a Sanchuniathon, who we've talked about in this podcast, writing about the peoples who lived in Canaan or Phoenicia and the gods that they worshipped long before these things were written down in the times of the Jews and the Hebrews. Nonetheless, if Berosus can be taken at face value, which there's nothing in the text that would suggest otherwise, then he would be in line with other ancient authors, those from South America, those in the Fertile Crescent Basin, and even some Native American myths, which talk about the wise ones bringing knowledge, whether they be from the heavens or from the sea. They weren't human. They're referred to as demigods or just flat out gods. And I don't have to tell you, as many of you will already know, the story of Enoch and the Watchers. So all of these things have a recurring theme. Some of it even occurs in Eastern cultures in Asia. So how did all of this get spread around the world if it isn't rooted in one singular event? Well, if we believe that the cradle of civilization, the birthplace of modern human civilization, was right here, smack dab in Mesopotamia, where the Sumerians and the Akkadians resided, then why wouldn't we suggest that the origin story for all of this began with this Paradu, this fish god named Oannes? And that everything else, the story of Prometheus, the story of Semjaza and the fallen Watchers, the story of Quetzalcoatl coming to the Olmec people in South America, what's to say that those weren't all spin-offs or derivatives of this one central event, this one story that occurred 3,000 to 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, that sparked off the rest of all of human history, which we're currently living through? What's interesting is that in all of these narratives, the gods, the Apkallu, whatever you want to call them, are represented in very similar fashion. If you recall the episode that we did with Jim Vieira over a year and a half ago now, he talked about these androgynous six-fingered deities holding man bags. And man bags, I put in quotes, obviously, it's not a technical or scientific term. But all of these creatures seem to be holding a bag in their hand. You look at representations of Quetzalcoatl, you look at representations of the Apkallu, you look at ancient representations of what the Anunnaki were. You'll see this theme recurring all over the place. In every ancient culture, these knowledge bringers or these wise ones seem to have a bag as if they're offering something. And Vieira had theories on that. Other scholars and researchers have had theories on that. My theory is that this is simply a representation of knowledge or wisdom being brought to mankind, basically sharing with them the gifts of the gods, whether it be about medicine, about the stars, about language, about mathematics. All of it was written down and presented to them. And you see this theme all over the world. Again, we have documentation in 1800 BC at the Olmec site of Leventa of Quetzalcoatl being portrayed this way. And it looks almost exactly the way Oannes is portrayed by the Akkadian peoples in their earliest drawings. But why are they always portrayed as chimeric type creatures? Quetzalcoatl, for example, the feathered serpent creature with the feathers of a bird, but also had features of a man. Oannes, half man, half fish. Many of the others, Apkallu, all have those fish-like features. Some of them have scales and talons as well. Some have wings. Why is that? I mean, if we want to get really outlandish, I mean, there's people who have said that the reference in the Bible to, as in the days of Noah, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be, that was a reference to crossbreeding and tampering with the human genome, as well as the genomic code of other creatures. And this is why when it says Noah was pure in all of his generations, that it was really a reference literally to the purity of his bloodline. Many believe that. I would say it's a minority view, but it could be viable if you consider it in the grand scheme of ancient Near Eastern literature, because we do see these chimeric creatures as far back as the Akkadians and Sumerians, and coming up as modern as the origins of Britain. And when you learn about Merlin, for example, it said that Merlin was a chimera. So this isn't new, it's very old, but it also spans the globe. So can we suggest that these creatures were simply some sort of demigods, half man, half other creature, a Genesis 6 type of solution to this problem? Or is it something else? Is it something else entirely? Something more scientific and a little bit more rational for our 21st century minds? Graham Hancock and others have proposed that these Apkallu, or these knowledge bringers, were simply explorers or survivors of a lost civilization. The one that gets thrown around the most, you got it, is Atlantis. Could it be that Oannes was simply a seafarer, a remnant from the collapsed, doomed civilization of Atlantis, who found his ways to the shores of the Mesopotamian Fertile Crescent and shared his gifts, the knowledge of the peoples of Atlantis? Modern spiritualists and thinkers like Edgar Cayce would propose this type of view. And maybe there's truth to it. I don't know. I don't claim to have the answer to this. Graham Hancock, I would say, would be the modern source who is the strongest authority on this type of view. And then the third view would be that these creatures were neither demigods nor remnants from an advanced civilization, but in fact they were extraterrestrials. And this is kind of where we started with the ancient aliens hypothesis, which you don't need me to explain to you. All three of these solutions are possible, but which one is the most probable? Which one seems the most likely when we weigh all of the evidence together? When I did a side-by-side comparison of the Apkallu with the Anunnaki, I found some interesting things. Again, number one is that they're almost always described in similar fashion in terms of their traits, their capabilities, and their defining attributes. What do I mean by that? They're almost always referred to as demigods or semigods, a little bit above human, but not quite on the same level as the supreme deity class, whether that be Marduk and his pantheon, or it be Yahweh, Jehovah of the Jewish Bible. There seemed to be an in-between there. The Semjazas, the Azazels, the Oannes of the world. They're all more than us, but less than them, if that makes sense. There also seems to be some intentionality around the numbers. So the Anunnaki are referenced in different numerical groups, but always in a limited set. Sometimes 70, sometimes 7, sometimes 72. The Watchers, the same thing. The 70 Watchers, the fallen ones, the sons of God. Again, sometimes referenced, I think the Septuagint says 72. Jesus references them in the New Testament as 70. It seems like a recurring theme from culture to culture. Well, the Apkallu are always referenced as a group of 7. These 7 wise ones, these 7 gatekeepers of wisdom. In terms of what they do and what service they provide to humanity, they sound very similar to the Anunnaki, if not identical. But their origin seems to be different. You see, the Anunnaki, or the Watchers, if we assume for a second that they're the same creature, just told through different cultural lenses, it says that they were the ones who fell from heaven. They left their first estate. So they basically came from the sky. They came from heaven, another realm, another place out there, whatever you want to call it, and then they came here of their own volition. Now, the Apkallu seem to have come of their own volition as well, but their origin is not the same. It says they came from below. They came from an underworld. In all the Babylonian sources, the Apkallu reside in the underworld. If you want a reference, you can look at the story of Inanna's descent into the netherworld, which is one of the most famous stories of Sumerian culture. Inanna, also known as Ishtar, basically descends into the underworld to conquer the domain of her older sister, who is the queen of the underworld, but instead she's found guilty of hubris by the 7 judges of the underworld, and they strike her dead. Now ultimately she's rescued by 2 androgynous beings. You might be able to compare them to angels, and they bring her back to the land of the living. But the story goes into detail about these 7 judges, and they seem to have power, but they seem to reside in this place of death, the afterlife, the Sumerian afterlife, underground beneath our planet in the myth. So I found it to be a head-scratcher that the only real difference between the Anunnaki and the Apkallu is that one seems to come from above and the other seems to come from below. So is this a yin and yang situation? Is this the same group of entities residing in 2 different locations? Or is it the exact same thing and we've just been confusing it because, like the telephone game, these things get passed down from culture to culture, from age to age, and they get mixed up to the point where the road eventually diverges into 2 paths. In my reading and research on this, I've come to the conclusion that the Apkallu and the Anunnaki are likely the same thing. At the very least, they're the same class of entity, and they seem to have their truest origin in the Akkadian and Sumerian origin stories. Oannes, the Pardu, the part man, part fish, seems to be a non-human entity, but here's the kicker. He did not come from outer space. This is not an ancient alien story. They were already here. They've been here all along. They've been here longer than us, if the myths are to be believed. And why does that matter? Well, if you look at the likes of Eric von Däniken, Chariots of the Gods, or Zecharia Sitchin, who's the one who really led to our modern ancient alien theory with the story of the Anunnaki, I believe that they were likely wrong. I don't think, even though it's popular to believe it in our time, with space exploration sparking all sorts of new interest, and the idea that man is going to be able to get off this planet and settle new places, new colonies on different planets, and one day maybe even terraform distant stars, it's popular to believe that ancient astronauts or aliens came here thousands of years ago, and they were the ones who generated knowledge and gave us that first spark. But what if, and in my opinion, it's an even wilder conclusion, what if we've been looking in all the wrong places for these entities? What if they are real, but they have been here all along? That this is their home, just like it's ours. You say, well, Josh, if that's the case, why don't we see them in everyday life? Why don't we engage with them? We have satellites that can map the entire planet. I'm pretty sure we would know if there were lost civilizations of chimeric type creatures walking around with great wisdom and knowledge. But would we? Is that necessarily true? Let's go back to what I said about Oannes. It said he came out of the sea. What we do know is that less of our own ocean has been explored than the moon's surface. Assuming, again, for a second that we did go to the moon. But if it's to be taken at face value, then what we know is that our own oceans remain largely unexplored, undiscovered. I mean, is it so hard to believe that a technologically advanced civilization wouldn't be able to colonize the interior parts of our planet? I mean, is it so hard to believe that an advanced civilization wouldn't be able to terraform the inner workings of this planet when we so easily believe that they must be out there in the known universe somewhere, when we haven't found any planet yet that can host life that kind of fits the Goldilocks criteria to sustain life? I think it's easier to believe that they're already here in a place where we know life can be sustained and that they could be hiding here, only coming out when they choose to. Maybe it sounds outlandish, but think about it. If they were advanced, say by thousands of years compared to what humans are, and they chose to retreat into the shadows for whatever reason, they could hide if they found a way to form civilizations in a subterranean sense. Now, I know I'm getting into Journey to the Center of the Earth territory, and I'm not talking about a hollow Earth here. I'm saying that there's a whole lot of in-between space, primarily with our oceans, but even apart from the oceans, below the Earth's crust, you've got a long way before you get to the core and before it gets too hot to be hollowed out for other purposes. And if this is a species that is not human, they may not need a sun in the sense that we need a sun. They may not function like we function. Now, why am I pushing this so hard? Why do I think that this is something that we need to consider and look into more than we have? Well, because as more and more knowledge about UFOs comes into public light, it's becoming apparent that we're overlooking a key piece of evidence in the UFO phenomena story. They don't all appear to be coming from up above in the sky. Many of these sightings are USOs, unidentified submerged objects, clearly able to navigate under the seas because they're spotted so many times by naval personnel from the nations of the world who see them coming in and out of the ocean, see them moving under the water's surface. The story that's perhaps gained the most attention over the last 10, 15 years, and if you haven't heard the story, I highly recommend you go watch his podcast with Lex Friedman or the podcast he did with Joe Rogan within the last year, but the story of David Fravor. David Fravor is a military pilot who is a no BS kind of guy. I mean, you can tell just listening to this guy talk for 5 minutes. He has no interest in fame or making money off of his story. If anything, it's hurt his life. I don't think it's put $1 in his pocket. And he's a very down-to-earth, intelligent man. I would argue that he's probably the smartest person in the room 9 times out of 10 in any room that he goes into. So this isn't somebody who's just trying to make up a story for you. This is somebody who is just trying to explain something that he found to be inexplainable in the moment. Well, David Fravor's story, he says that he and his partner, and this thing showed up on radar as well, so there's multiple other witnesses, he and his partner saw this thing move at speeds that are unfathomable, speeds that the most advanced military aircraft today can't even touch. And they basically saw it drop 60,000 feet in a matter of seconds, go beneath the earth, the surface of the water, and then continue to accelerate under the water. Who has that capability? I mean, we're not talking submarine or stealth fighter technology. We're talking technology that is unknown to humankind. Just like several thousand years ago, the basic knowledge that Oannes and others would have brought out of the sea would have been unknown to mankind. Could these be the same creatures? I did a series a couple of years ago about Herodotus and his histories of the ancient world, and he talks about a group of people called the Hyperboreans. Now, it was common knowledge at the time among the Greeks and the Persians that these Hyperboreans lived in the lands to the north, close to the Arctic Circle, which in that episode I concluded I believed was near the Caucasus Mountains, maybe up in as far as modern-day Russia and Siberia. But essentially these were godlike entities who, for whatever reason, chose to retreat underground. And granted, this is over 2,500 years ago. So this was being written about then. Herodotus, whom many think was a kook, we call him the father of history, but also the father of lies, because some of his stories seem so outlandish for modern listeners that we just can't comprehend them as fact, so we write them up as myth. But I think we do that to our own disservice. Now, without repeating that podcast, I just want to bring your attention to the Hyperboreans, because the Hyperboreans were said to have been so wise and so advanced at their time. However, they also were separate, and they went their own way. And essentially, these Hyperboreans were recluses. They didn't really engage with the other civilizations of the world, and they ultimately went underground. Now, most say the Hyperboreans were either just a myth or they died out and they no longer exist. Well, maybe. But if they still exist, the last thing we heard about the Hyperboreans was that they went underground and that they were intelligent and advanced. I mean, it sounds like the puzzle pieces fit together pretty well there, in my opinion. So I would conclude here, in all the noise about extraterrestrials and aliens from outer space, maybe this world does, after all, hold more secrets for us yet to be discovered. Maybe there are new frontiers beneath the Earth's surface, and that there are visitors, and that there are intelligences apart from our own residing on this planet. And while we're looking up, they're right beneath our feet. Consider for a moment how foreign that narrative is to the modern zeitgeist, but also how plausible it could be compared to some of these other theories. Is it easier to believe that creatures flew in spacecrafts from light years away without any sight from our satellites or any observation from the skies, and then they continue to just appear within our atmosphere? Or is it easier to believe that they've been here all along and that it's so easier for them to be undetected because they exist already in their own locations beneath the Earth's surface, beneath the sea? And that maybe governments are aware of this. I certainly suspect that no matter where they come from, our governments probably are, at least at a basic level in communication, or well aware of the origin of all this. I mean, Bob Lazar said that when he worked at Area 51, it was presented to him that these recovered aircrafts were actually found in archaeological digs. If that's true, that's a game changer. It doesn't negate that they could come from outer space, but it does suggest that maybe they've been here a lot longer than we think, and maybe they've been here all along. In Indian culture, the country of India, not Native Americans, they talked about the flying Vimanas. And this is going back to the cultures of the Indus River Valley. And they said that the flying Vimanas were basically spacecraft occupied by these gods who resided here with us on this earth. To me, these puzzle pieces fit together, but nobody seems to be paying attention to them. We all want fanciful stories of extraterrestrials from the Pleiades or the Dog Star, and we just assume that these things come from out there. But what if they're right here, and they've always been right here? I don't know the answer to the question, but I do think that this is the most plausible of all theories that have been proposed. I do think that Hancock, von Däniken, even Sitchin meant well, and they truly did think that their views and interpretations, and do think, are the most plausible. But I think when you look at everything holistically, that this is the most plausible interpretation of the evidence at hand. I do think that the story of Oannes, the story of the Watchers, the story of the Apakalu are all rooted in a singular event, a real event that took place here on this planet. But the guests, the knowledge bringers, the wise ones, did not come from the heavens. I don't believe that they were the ones who from the heavens came. I don't think that they came from somewhere out in the Pleiades. I don't think that they came from another dimension even. I think there's reason to believe that they are right here with us now, and that one day that's going to be presented to us and we won't be able to deny it any longer. So you can consider the evidence and come to your own conclusion. This is what I think. And like I believed the Hyperboreans existed and that Herodotus wasn't just making things up on a whim or passing along urban legends, I think that these USO sightings and these myths and stories that have been passed down for generations fit hand in hand beautifully, and that they're here with us now. Hey guys, thanks for sticking around. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I'm trying to get away from current events and some of the noise in the media for a little while and get back to the roots of this show and the bigger picture, more abstract ideas, anthropology, archaeology, history, esotericism, all the things that I love and I know you love too. So stick around with me. I got some great things coming up for you on deck. In a couple weeks, I'm going to be having an interview with Robert Bonomo, who, if you recall, we had on the podcast about a year and a half ago now, and we talked about his documentary series, The 21 Faces of God. Well, now he's back with a new film called Twilight of the Archons, and I just watched it, and I want to tell you guys that it's awesome. So I highly recommend you checking it out on YouTube if you haven't already. Thanks for sticking with the podcast, guys. I know that starting last summer, there was a bit of a hiatus given myself going through the ringer like so many others in 2020 during COVID and all of the chaos and disorder that came with it. So thankful to still be here on the other side of it all and moving into the next phase of whatever 2021 and beyond will bring us, guys. I don't think that we're out of the woods yet. I'm not just talking about the virus, but I'm talking about the global shifting reality beneath our feet, which I think is going to continue for the better part of this decade, leading up to some what I think will be cataclysmic events by the early 2030s, which we've talked about in recent podcasts. So it's my intention to be along for the ride, either through this podcast or through other avenues in communication with some of you who are like-minded and also trying to discern what might be coming for us down the road. You can find me through email. That's josh@joshuawisely.com or jwisely7@gmail.com. Both will get to me. Or you can also reach out through the show notes as well. Feel free to support us. I always do a terrible job of marketing and advertising that, but we do have a website. That's joshuawisely.com, where you can find a link to the Eschaton podcast, our entire library of shows there, as well as a link to our Patreon page. $1 a show really would go a long way to helping this show grow in terms of marketing the content. Everything that goes into this show goes right back into this show. So if you are able to support the show, I do appreciate it. You can support us through PayPal or through Patreon. And even if you can't, just share the podcast with somebody else, guys. That is always going to be the number one thing you can do for this show. So please leave us a 5-star review and tell somebody about it. I really do thank you guys, those of you who have done it already. It's awesome to have so much support and the kind emails from time to time. It really give me the motivation to keep this thing going, because I'll be honest with you, between my day job, family life, and all the other trials and tribulations in the world right now, in my own personal world right now, it's not always easy to put together enough gumption to research and record a podcast. So I'm going to keep it going as long as you guys are willing to keep listening. Take care, everybody. I'll be back soon, and we'll have another podcast for you on deck. Cheers.
And anytime you introduce fear into a logical process, whether it's linear, spherical, or otherwise, you're going to distort things.